The morning the Parkers arrived in Clearwater was as ordinary as any other summer day, or at least it seemed so at first. The sun was already high, casting a blinding white glare on the dirt roads. Maggie sat on the front porch, her legs dangling over the side, peeling the dried mud off her shoes. A single truck, laden with furniture and driven by a man she didn't recognize, rumbled past the Hayes house and down the road. The sound of the engine echoed like a ripple through the quiet. Maggie watched the truck disappear around the bend. Her curiosity piqued. Newcomers were rare in Clearwater, and furniture trucks were rarer still. She craned her neck to see where it was headed. Her hands paused mid-motion when the truck finally stopped at a small, rundown house on the far end of town. Maggie felt an inexplicable pull to know more. "Who's moving in?" she asked, turning to Eleanor, who was sitting in her usual spot, mending an old quilt. The older woman squinted down the road but made no move to stand. "Nobody we know," she said, her tone nonchalant but her hands slowing. "Probably some folks passing through. Don't get too worked up about it." But Maggie couldn't help it. New people meant new stories, new possibilities, and she wanted to be the first to uncover them. Later that afternoon, while Eleanor napped in the living room, Maggie wandered down the road, pretending to collect wildflowers. She kept an eye on the newly occupied house, watching as a boy about her age struggled to carry a wooden crate across the yard. He was thin but wiry, with dark skin that gleamed in the sunlight and an expression of stubborn determination. "Need some help?" Maggie called out before she could stop herself. The boy paused, setting the crate down with a thud. He looked up at her, and for a moment, Maggie thought he might ignore her. Then he straightened, wiped his hands on his pants, and grinned. "Sure, if you don't mind getting your hands dirty," he said. Maggie jogged over, her curiosity outweighing any reservations. The crate was heavier than she expected, but between the two of them, they managed to carry it to the porch. "I'm Maggie," she said, brushing the dirt off her hands. "Ben," he replied, then added, "Parker, you just moved here?" "Yeah, from over in Hammond. My dad got a job at the mill." Hammond was a larger town about 20 miles away. Maggie had been there once with Eleanor to buy supplies, but it felt like another world compared to Clearwater. "You'll hate it here," Maggie said bluntly. "There's nothing to do." Ben laughed, a sound as light and unexpected as a summer breeze. "We'll see about that." Over the next few days, Maggie found herself drawn to the Parkers' house more often than she intended. She told herself it was just to satisfy her curiosity, but she liked talking to Ben. He was different from the other kids in Clearwater. More imaginative, more curious. He told her stories about Hammond, about the bustling streets and noisy markets, about the kite festival his family used to attend every spring. Maggie, in turn, showed him her favorite hiding spots: the hollowed-out tree near the riverbank, the abandoned barn on the edge of town, the field where the wildflowers grew thickest. Ben seemed to absorb everything with an open-hearted wonder that Maggie found contagious. But not everyone in Clearwater shared her enthusiasm. At the general store, Maggie overheard Mrs. Wilkes, the town's unofficial gossip, talking to Mr. Grady, the store owner. "Can't believe they'd just move in like that," Mrs. Wilkes was saying, her voice low but sharp. "Didn't they know what kind of town this is?" Mr. Grady shrugged, stacking cans on a shelf. "Not much we can do about it, long as they keep to themselves. I don't see the harm." Maggie pretended to examine a jar of pickles, her ears burning. She wasn't entirely sure what Mrs. Wilkes meant, but she knew it wasn't kind. That evening, she asked Eleanor about it. "Why don't people like the Parkers?" she asked. Eleanor sighed, setting down her knitting. "It's not that they don't like them, Maggie. It's just people around here aren't used to change. And sometimes, when folks aren't used to something, they get scared. They say things they shouldn't." "Like what?" Maggie pressed. "Never you mind," Eleanor said firmly. "Just remember, everyone deserves kindness, no matter what anyone else says." But Maggie couldn't let it go. She couldn't understand why anyone would dislike Ben or his family. They were kind and hardworking and didn't seem any different from anyone else in Clearwater. Yet the whispers persisted, growing louder and more pointed. One afternoon, as Maggie and Ben were playing near the river, a group of older boys approached. Maggie recognized them, Billy Tate and his gang, known troublemakers in Clearwater. Billy was 14, tall and broad-shouldered, with a permanent smirk that made Maggie's skin crawl. "Hey, Maggie," Billy called out, his tone mocking. "What are you doing with him?" Maggie froze, her heart pounding. Ben stood his ground, his expression calm but watchful. "None of your business," Maggie shot back, trying to keep her voice steady. Billy laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Ain't right, you know, him being here. You oughta know better." Maggie clenched her fists, her face burning with anger and embarrassment. But before she could say anything, Ben stepped forward. "I don't think it's up to you where I go," he said, his voice steady. Billy's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. "You better watch yourself," he muttered before turning and walking away, his gang trailing behind. Maggie felt a surge of relief and admiration. Ben didn't say anything, but she could tell he wasn't afraid. If anything, he seemed more determined than ever to prove he belonged. The summer wore on, and the tension in Clearwater simmered like the heat in the air. Maggie and Ben continued to explore the town, but they were more cautious now, avoiding certain streets and keeping an eye out for trouble. Maggie hated the way people looked at Ben, the way their smiles turned to frowns when he entered a room. She hated the whispers, the sideways glances, the unspoken rules that everyone seemed to follow without question. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the fireflies dance in the fading light, Maggie turned to Eleanor. "Why do people care so much about skin?" she asked. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she sighed and said, "Because sometimes, Maggie, people are afraid of what they don't understand. And instead of trying to learn, they let that fear turn into hate." Maggie didn't fully understand, but she nodded, filing the words away in her mind. She knew one thing for sure. She wouldn't let fear dictate her choices. Not now, not ever. But as the days grew shorter and the cicadas' song faded, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. She just didn't know what or how much it would cost. The first sign of trouble came one sweltering morning in late July. Maggie was sitting cross-legged on the front porch, biting into a slice of watermelon, the sticky juice running down her arms, when she saw Ruth Parker walking toward the Hayes house. Ruth carried a basket in her hands, a look of calm determination on her face despite the heat. Maggie immediately sat up straighter, watching her approach. Eleanor, who had been shelling peas in a bowl at her feet, raised an eyebrow but said nothing as Ruth climbed the porch steps. "Good morning, Mrs. Hayes," Ruth said, her voice steady but warm. "I brought some peaches from our tree. Thought you might like them." Eleanor glanced at the basket, then at Ruth, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the only sound was the buzzing of a cicada somewhere nearby. "Well, that's kind of you," Eleanor said finally, wiping her hands on her apron. "Thank you." Ruth placed the basket on the porch and smiled at Maggie. "You must be Margaret." "Maggie," she corrected quickly. "Everyone calls me Maggie." "Well, Maggie," Ruth said. "Ben talks about you all the time. I think you've made quite an impression on him." Maggie felt her cheeks flush, but she smiled back. "Ben's my friend," she said simply. Ruth's smile softened. "He's lucky to have a friend like you." As soon as Ruth left, Eleanor sighed and stood, gathering her bowl of peas. "I hope you understand, Maggie," she said, her tone quiet but firm, "that not everyone in this town is going to be as polite as I am." Maggie frowned, confused. Why wouldn't they be? Mrs. Parker was nice. She didn't do anything wrong. "It's not about right or wrong," Eleanor said, her voice heavy. "It's about People feeling like their way of life is being challenged. And when people feel threatened, they don't always act kindly. Maggie didn't reply. She didn't understand how being nice or planting peaches or fixing kites could threaten anyone. It seemed silly, even ridiculous, but she could tell Eleanor was worried, and that made her uneasy. That evening, the uneasiness turned into something sharper. Maggie and Ben were sitting on the riverbank, skipping stones across the water, when Ben suddenly stopped and looked over his shoulder. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. Maggie froze, her hand clutching a smooth, flat stone. At first, she didn't hear anything, but then a faint rustling reached her ears. It sounded like someone moving through the brush behind them. "Probably just a raccoon," she said, though her voice wavered. Ben didn't look convinced. He stood, brushing the dirt from his pants, and glanced around. "We should go," he said. Maggie nodded, her heart pounding. They grabbed their things and started back toward the field, walking quickly but trying not to run. When they reached the open stretch of grass, Maggie risked a glance behind them but saw nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. The next day, Ben showed up at Maggie's house with a bruise on his cheek. "What happened?" Maggie demanded, her voice sharp with concern. Ben hesitated, then shrugged. "Just some boys messing around." Maggie wasn't convinced. "Was it Billy?" she asked, her hands curling into fists. Ben didn't answer, which was all the confirmation she needed. She stomped inside, ready to tell Eleanor, but Ben grabbed her arm. "Don't," he said. "It'll just make things worse." Maggie hesitated, torn between anger and fear. "It's not fair," she muttered. "They don't even know you." Ben gave her a small, sad smile. "They don't want to." The bruise wasn't the last. Over the next few weeks, Maggie noticed little things. A rock thrown through the Parker family's window, whispers that grew louder when Ben walked by, the way shopkeepers hesitated before serving Ruth. Maggie hated it. She hated the way people acted like Ben and his family didn't belong, as if Clearwater wasn't big enough for all of them. One afternoon, as they sat in the shade of the old oak tree near the river, Maggie blurted out, "Why don't you leave?" Ben looked up, startled. "What?" "I mean," Maggie said quickly, "you could go somewhere better. Somewhere people aren't so mean." Ben shook his head. "My dad says running away doesn't solve anything. He says the only way to change things is to stay and fight." "Fight who?" Maggie asked, exasperated. "The whole town." "Maybe," Ben said quietly, "maybe it's not about fighting people. Maybe it's about fighting the way they think." Maggie didn't know what to say. She wanted to believe Ben was right, but she wasn't sure Clearwater could ever change. That belief was put to the test one Saturday afternoon. Maggie and Ben were walking back from the general store, carrying a bag of flour Ruth had asked for, when they saw a small group of men standing on the Parker family's lawn. Louis Parker was standing on the porch, his arms crossed, his face calm but stern. "What's going on?" Maggie whispered. Ben's jaw tightened. "Stay here," he said, handing her the bag of flour. "Ben, wait," but he was already walking toward the house. Maggie hesitated for a moment, then followed, her heart pounding. As they got closer, Maggie recognized some of the men Billy's father, Mr. Tate, and a few others she'd seen around town. They were speaking loudly, their words sharp and angry, though Maggie couldn't make out everything they were saying. "You think you can just come in here and take over?" Mr. Tate was shouting. "This town doesn't need people like you." Louis didn't flinch. "I'm not here to take anything," he said calmly. "I'm here to work, just like you. Work somewhere else." Another man spat. "You don't belong here." Ben stepped forward. "My dad belongs wherever he wants to be," he said, his voice steady despite the fear Maggie could see in his eyes. The men turned to look at him, their expressions darkening. For a moment, Maggie thought they might do something terrible, but then Eleanor's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "That's enough," she said, striding up the road toward them. Her presence was like a thunderstorm, sudden and impossible to ignore. The men looked at her, startled. Even Louis seemed surprised. "You should all be ashamed of yourselves," Eleanor said, her voice trembling with anger. "This is a family, just like yours. They've done nothing to you." Mr. Tate opened his mouth to argue, but Eleanor silenced him with a glare. "Get off their property," she said. "Now." For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the men began to shuffle away, muttering under their breath. Maggie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. When they were gone, Eleanor turned to Louis and Ruth. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "Some people around here don't know how to mind their own business." Louis nodded, his expression softening. "Thank you, Mrs. Hayes." Maggie looked at Eleanor in awe. She had never seen her grandmother stand up to anyone like that before. In that moment, she realized that change wasn't just about fighting, it was about courage. And maybe, just maybe, Clearwater could change after all. The days following Eleanor's confrontation were marked by an uneasy calm. Maggie noticed fewer whispered conversations in the streets, and the tension seemed to hang in the air like the oppressive summer heat. Yet, underneath the surface, it was clear that not everyone in Clearwater agreed with Eleanor's stand. For the first time in her life, Maggie saw her grandmother in a different light. Eleanor was not just a caretaker or a quiet figure in the background of Maggie's life. She had stood up against the town's silent rules, and that made her brave. But Maggie also saw how tired Eleanor seemed afterward, how she spent more time sitting in her rocking chair, staring out at the fields as if searching for answers in the horizon. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in shades of gold, Maggie found Eleanor on the porch, a glass of iced tea in her hand. "Grandma," Maggie began hesitantly, "why did you do it? Why did you stand up for them?" Eleanor sighed, setting the glass down. "Because it was the right thing to do," she said simply. "But don't you care what people think?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "Maggie, if I spent my whole life worrying about what other people think, I'd never get anything done. Sometimes you have to choose between doing what's easy and doing what's right." Maggie nodded, but her mind was still restless. She thought of Ben, of his quiet defiance, and wondered if he felt the same way. Meanwhile, at the Parker house, tensions within the family were beginning to show. Ben's father, Louis, was determined to stay in Clearwater despite the growing hostility. "We've got just as much right to be here as anyone else," he told Ruth one night as they sat at the kitchen table. "I'm not going to let a few small-minded people run us out." Ruth, however, was less certain. She worried about Ben, about the way the other boys in town looked at him, about the bruises he came home with and refused to explain. "I'm just saying, maybe it's not worth it," Ruth said softly, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "Maybe we should think about going back to Hammond. At least there, we had a community." Louis shook his head. "Running isn't the answer. If we leave now, what kind of message are we sending to Ben? That it's okay to give up when things get hard? No, he needs to see that standing your ground is important." Ben listened from his bedroom, his stomach twisting into knots. He didn't know how to feel. On the one hand, he admired his father's resolve. On the other, he couldn't help but wonder if his mother was right. How much longer could they endure the unspoken, and sometimes spoken, hostility of the town? The next Saturday, a storm rolled into Clearwater. Dark clouds gathered over the fields, and the wind whipped through the trees, scattering leaves and dust. Maggie and Ben met at their usual spot by the river, their moods as turbulent as the weather. "Do you ever wish you could just leave?" Maggie asked, hugging her knees to her chest as the first raindrops began to fall. "All the time," Ben admitted. "But my dad says we have to stay, that it's about more than just us." Maggie frowned. "What does that even mean? Why can't you just go somewhere better?" "Because everywhere has problems," Ben said. "If it's not this, it's something else. My dad says you can't run from everything. At some point, You have to stand and fight. Maggie thought about this for a moment. I don't think I'd be brave enough to fight, she said quietly. Ben looked at her, his expression serious. You're braver than you think. The storm that night was the worst Clearwater had seen in years. Thunder rattled the windows, and lightning lit up the sky in jagged streaks. Maggie lay awake in bed, the sound of the rain pounding on the roof keeping her from sleep. She couldn't stop thinking about what Ben had said, about standing and fighting. She didn't feel brave, but maybe that was the point. Maybe bravery wasn't about not being scared, it was about doing the right thing even when you were. The storm passed by morning, leaving the streets muddy and the air heavy with the smell of wet earth. Maggie woke to the sound of raised voices outside. She hurried to the window and saw a small crowd gathered in the street. At the center of it was Mr. Tate, holding a sign with words Maggie couldn't quite make out from her vantage point. She ran downstairs, her heart pounding. Eleanor was already on the porch, her arms crossed and her jaw set. Maggie followed her gaze and felt her stomach drop. The sign read, "Clearwater's no place for outsiders." Eleanor didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, she turned to Maggie and said, "Stay here." "But." "No buts," Eleanor said firmly. "Stay." Maggie watched as her grandmother walked down the road toward the crowd, her back straight and her head high. She wanted to follow, but something in Eleanor's tone kept her rooted to the spot. Eleanor's confrontation with Mr. Tate was brief but heated. "You should be ashamed of yourself, stirring up trouble like this," she said, her voice sharp. "This isn't about trouble," Mr. Tate shot back. "It's about protecting our town." "Protecting it from what?" Eleanor demanded. "From decent, hardworking people who've done nothing wrong? If that's your idea of protection, then maybe it's this town that needs protecting from you." The crowd murmured, uneasy. Mr. Tate glared at Eleanor but didn't respond. After a tense moment, he turned and walked away, taking his sign with him. The crowd dispersed soon after, leaving the street quiet once more. That evening, Lewis Parker came to the Hayes house. Maggie watched from the kitchen as he spoke to Eleanor on the porch. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could see the gratitude in Lewis's expression and the way Eleanor nodded, her face calm but resolute. When Eleanor came back inside, Maggie asked, "What did he want?" "To thank me," Eleanor said simply. "For what?" "For standing with them," Eleanor replied. "It's not much, but sometimes a little support can make all the difference." Maggie nodded, her heart swelling with pride. For the first time, she understood what Ben and his father meant about standing and fighting. It wasn't always about grand gestures or big battles. Sometimes, it was as simple as speaking up, as standing beside someone when they needed it most. But the events of that day were only the beginning. The simmering tension in Clearwater was far from over, and Maggie could feel it in the air, an uneasy stillness, like the calm before another storm. And though she didn't know what was coming, she knew one thing for certain: whatever happened next, she wouldn't let fear hold her back. The days following the confrontation on the street brought a strange, heavy quiet to Clearwater. It was the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but waiting, an unsettling pause, like the deep breath before a scream. Maggie felt it everywhere she went, in the cautious looks from neighbors, in the clipped conversations that stopped when she walked into a room, and most of all, in the way Ben avoided talking about what had happened. First, Maggie thought Ben might be upset with her. He didn't meet her at their usual spot by the river, and when she went to his house, Ruth told her he was helping Lewis repair the fence. But Maggie knew better. Ben wasn't hiding from chores, he was hiding from the weight of what had happened. Finally, Maggie decided enough was enough. On a cloudy afternoon, when the sun barely managed to break through the thick, gray sky, she marched to the Parker house and knocked on the door. Lewis answered, his expression weary but kind. "Hello, Maggie," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "Ben's out back." Maggie thanked him and headed to the yard, where she found Ben sitting under a tree, carving something out of a piece of wood. He didn't look up as she approached. "You've been avoiding me," Maggie said, standing in front of him with her hands on her hips. Ben glanced at her but said nothing, his knife working steadily on the wood. Maggie huffed and sat down across from him, folding her arms. "I don't know why you're mad at me," she said. "I didn't do anything wrong." "I'm not mad at you," Ben muttered. "Then why are you acting like this?" Ben let out a long sigh and set the wood and knife aside. I don't know. I guess I didn't want you to see how bad it really is." "What do you mean?" Ben picked at the grass, his expression distant. "This town, the way people look at us, the way they talk, is not gonna change. Maggie, not really. And I don't want you to get hurt because of me." Maggie frowned. "You think I care about what they think? They're wrong, Ben. You and your family don't deserve this." "It doesn't matter if we deserve it," Ben said quietly. "It's just the way things are." "No, it's not," Maggie said firmly. "It doesn't have to be." Ben looked at her then, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sadness. "You don't get it, Maggie. You don't know what it's like." "Then help me understand," Maggie said, her voice softer now. "Tell me." For a long moment, Ben didn't say anything. Then, finally, he began to speak. He told her about the whispers in Hammond, about the subtle and not so subtle ways people made it clear they didn't belong. He told her about the fear he saw in his mother's eyes every time they went out in public, the weight his father carried every day just to keep the family together. Maggie listened, her chest tightening with every word. She had always known that life wasn't fair, but hearing it from Ben made it feel real in a way it never had before. "I'm sorry," she said when he finished. "I wish I could fix it." Ben shook his head. "It's not your job to fix it, Maggie, but you being my friend, that helps more than you know." The next week brought another storm, not of weather but of whispers and warnings. The Parker family became the focal point of a growing division in Clearwater. Some, like Eleanor, spoke up in their defense, insisting that the Parkers had every right to live and work in the town. Others, led by men like Mr. Tate, saw their presence as a threat to the town's way of life. One afternoon, as Maggie walked home from the general store, she saw a group of boys gathered near the old church, their voices low and conspiratorial. She recognized Billy Tate at the center, his arms crossed and his expression smug. "What are you planning?" Maggie demanded, stepping closer. The boys looked up, startled, but Billy recovered quickly. "None of your business, Hayes." "It is my business if it has to do with Ben," Maggie shot back. Billy smirked. "Why do you care so much? Anyway, he's not one of us." Maggie felt her face flush with anger. "He's my friend," she said, her voice trembling. "And if you try to hurt him, I'll tell everyone what cowards you are." Billy's smirk faltered, but his bravado held. "Watch yourself, Maggie. You're sticking your neck out for the wrong people." Maggie stood her ground, glaring at him until the boys finally dispersed. Her heart pounded as she walked away, but she refused to let them see her fear. That evening, Maggie told Eleanor what had happened. Her grandmother listened quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "They're just boys," Eleanor said after a long pause. "But boys like that can do a lot of harm if they're not stopped." "What can we do?" Maggie asked. "We can't just let them get away with it." Eleanor looked at her, her eyes filled with a mix of pride and worry. "We stand by the Parkers," she said, "no matter what." The next day, Maggie and Eleanor walked to the Parker house together, carrying a basket of food. Ruth greeted them with a warm but tired smile, and Louis invited them inside. The conversation was strained at first, but soon, the tension eased as Eleanor and Louis began discussing ways to rally support in the community. "We need to show them that not everyone in Clearwater feels the same way," Eleanor said. "If we can get enough people to speak out, it might make a difference." Louis nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's worth a try, but we'll have to be careful." People like Mr. Tate don't take kindly to being challenged. As the days passed, Eleanor and Louis quietly began reaching out to their neighbors, asking for support. Some were hesitant, afraid of the backlash, but others agreed to stand with the Parkers. Maggie watched as her grandmother became a force to be reckoned with, her determination unwavering despite the odds. But the opposition was just as determined. Mr. Tate and his followers began organizing meetings of their own, spreading fear and lies about the Parkers. The tension in the town grew thicker, like a storm cloud ready to burst. And then, one fateful night, it did. The sound of shattering glass woke Maggie from a restless sleep. She sat up, her heart racing, and ran to the window. Down the road, she saw flickering orange flames licking at the edges of the Parker house. "Grandma!" Maggie cried, running to Eleanor's room. "The Parker's house is on fire." Eleanor was already awake, pulling on her robe. "Stay here, Maggie," she said, her voice firm. "No, I'm coming with you." "Maggie, I'm not staying," Maggie said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Ben needs me." Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Together, they ran toward the fire, their hearts pounding with fear. When they arrived, they found the Parkers standing in the yard, their faces illuminated by the flames. Louis and Ruth were trying to calm Ben, who was shouting angrily, his fists clenched. "They did this," Ben yelled. "Those cowards." "Ben," Louis said sharply, "this isn't the time." Maggie ran to Ben, grabbing his hand. "Are you okay?" Ben nodded, though his eyes were filled with tears. "We're fine. But the house." Eleanor turned to Louis. "What can we do?" Louis shook his head. "Just being here helps," he said. "Thank you." As the townspeople began to gather, some with buckets to help put out the fire, Maggie saw Mr. Tate standing on the edge of the crowd, his expression cold and unrepentant. For the first time, she truly understood the depth of his hatred and the courage it would take to fight it. The night after the fire at the Parker house was one of restless unease. Maggie lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the acrid smell of smoke still clinging to her hair and clothes. Her mind replayed the events over and over, the flames licking at the walls, the shouts of her grandmother and Louis, the quiet fury in Mr. Tate's eyes, and the haunting silence that followed his retreat. Though the fire was extinguished, the embers of conflict in Clearwater still burned, threatening to erupt again at any moment. Maggie glanced at the clock on the wall. It was past midnight, but sleep seemed impossible. Slipping out of bed, she crept downstairs and out onto the porch. The cool night air did little to calm her racing thoughts. Across the fields, she could just make out the dark silhouette of what was left of the Parker house. It looked small and vulnerable against the vast expanse of the sky. Eleanor's voice startled her. "Couldn't sleep either." "Ha!" Maggie turned to see her grandmother standing in the doorway, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She carried 2 mugs of warm milk, handing one to Maggie before sitting beside her on the porch steps. "Do you think they'll stay?" Maggie asked after a long silence. Eleanor sipped her milk, her expression thoughtful. "They're strong people, Maggie, stronger than most. But even the strongest have their limits." "I don't want them to leave," Maggie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not fair. They shouldn't have to." "No, it's not fair," Eleanor agreed. "But life often isn't. That's why people like us have to make it better." The following morning, Clearwater awoke to the stark reality of what had happened. The Parker house, once a modest but sturdy home, was now little more than a charred frame. The scent of burnt wood lingered in the air, a tangible reminder of the hatred that had taken root in the town. But something else lingered, too, a quiet defiance. As word of the fire spread, so did a sense of urgency among those who had begun to question Clearwater's unspoken rules. Eleanor's bold stand, followed by the efforts of others in the community, had planted a seed. Now, it was up to them to nurture it. By mid-morning, Neighbors began arriving at the Parker property with tools, lumber, and offers of help. Maggie watched from the road as a group of women, led by Mrs. Wilkes, approached Ruth Parker with baskets of food and clothes. Ruth hesitated at first, clearly wary, but eventually accepted their kindness with a grateful nod. Ben and Louis were in the yard, clearing debris from the wreckage. Maggie joined them without a word, grabbing a shovel and setting to work. She and Ben worked side by side, their movements rhythmic and purposeful. Occasionally, their eyes met, and though they didn't speak, Maggie felt a renewed sense of solidarity between them. As the hours passed, more people arrived, some out of genuine support, others out of curiosity or guilt. Among them was Reverend Holloway, the pastor of Clearwater's only church. He was a tall, soft-spoken man with a commanding presence, and his arrival seemed to shift the atmosphere. "Mr. Parker," the Reverend said, extending a hand to Louis, "I'm deeply sorry for what's happened here. If there's anything the church can do to help, please don't hesitate to ask." Louis hesitated, clearly torn between pride and gratitude, but eventually shook the Reverend's hand. "Thank you," he said simply. Not everyone in Clearwater was supportive. However, Mr. Tate and his followers stayed away, but their absence was as loud as any accusation. Rumors began to circulate that the fire had been deliberately set, a rumor Maggie suspected was true, though no one dared say it aloud. The tension came to a head 3 days after the fire. During a town meeting called by Reverend Holloway, the church was packed, its pews filled with people of every persuasion, those who supported the Parkers, those who opposed them, and those who weren't sure where they stood. Maggie sat with Eleanor near the front, her heart pounding as the meeting began. The Reverend opened with a prayer, asking for wisdom and unity, before inviting Louis to speak. Louis stood at the front of the church, his hands clasped tightly together. He looked out at the crowd, his expression calm but resolute. "My family came to Clearwater because we believed it could be a place of opportunity," he began. "We didn't come to cause trouble or to take anything from anyone. We came to work, to build a life, just like all of you." There were murmurs of agreement, but also a few scoffs from the back of the room. Louis pressed on. "I know some of you don't want us here," he said. "I know some of you see us as outsiders, as threats, but we're not here to threaten you. We're here to be part of this community, to contribute, and we're not leaving." His words hung in the air, heavy with conviction. For a moment, the church was silent. Then Mr. Tate stood, his face red with anger. "You talk a good game, Parker," he said, his voice loud and accusatory. "But talk doesn't change the fact that this town doesn't need people like you." The room erupted into a mix of shouting and murmurs. Maggie felt her fists clench at her sides, her anger bubbling to the surface. But before she could speak, Eleanor stood, her voice cutting through the noise. "This town doesn't need hatred, either," Eleanor said, her voice steady and clear. "We've all seen what it leads to, a burned house, a divided community. Is that the kind of town we want to be?" The crowd quieted, the weight of her words settling over them. Even Mr. Tate seemed momentarily taken aback. Reverend Holloway stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Hatred has no place in Clearwater," he said. "We have a choice to make tonight. We can continue down this path of division, or we can choose to come together as a community. The choice is ours." The meeting ended without a clear resolution, but the conversations it sparked continued long after the church emptied. For Maggie, it was a turning point, a moment when she realized that change was not something that happened overnight, but something that had to be fought for, step by step. In the weeks that followed, the Parker family began to rebuild. With the help of those who had chosen to stand with them, Maggie spent every spare moment at the site, hammering nails, painting walls, and doing whatever else needed to be done. She watched as the new house took shape, rising from the ashes like a symbol of resilience and hope. One afternoon, as they worked together in the yard, Ben turned to Maggie with a shy smile. "You know, you're pretty tough for a girl." Maggie laughed, the sound light and free. "And you're not so bad for a boy." Their laughter echoed across the fields, a reminder that even in the face of hardship, there was still room for joy. The day the Parker family moved into their new house was a celebration. Neighbors gathered in the yard, bringing food, flowers, and warm wishes. Maggie stood with Eleanor, watching as Ruth and Louis welcomed everyone with open arms. As the sun set over Clearwater, casting the town in a warm, golden glow, Maggie felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, felt like Clearwater was moving in the right direction. And as she and Ben sat together on the porch of his new house, watching the stars appear one by one, Maggie knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together.